why, but also how we should act on climate change, and really the importance of changing our own behaviour. Of course, we've seen from the IPCC reports, the scientific assessments, that climate change is really an urgent issue that we need to act on as soon as possible if we're to avoid the sorts of very dramatic impacts that we've already started to see. For example, the Australian bushfires, floods and other extreme weather events, disruption to food supplies, impacts in terms of migration of people, spread of disease and so on. So that the range of impacts is very wide-ranging. So we're going to be increasingly impacted by climate change. But also, climate change is not only a scientific issue, we have learned about it through science, but it is also an ethical and moral issue. The reason we can say this is because actually we know that the people that are going to be most affected by climate change are generally the people that have the least in society, that they are the poorest and most vulnerable. They're the least able to cope with and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And yet, those are exactly the people that have not actually caused climate change to the extent that more wealthy countries and individuals have. So income tends to be a very strong predictor of our carbon footprint. So the people who are impacted the most by climate change are the least to blame. Another ethical aspect is what's also called intergenerational justice. So this is particularly thinking about young people and how actually, because the worst impacts are going to be in the future, that will be the world that young people inherit. And yet young people, of course, are not necessarily able to participate in decision making as fully as adults. So they can't vote, for example, and yet they will experience the worst impacts in the future. So of course, young people are particularly concerned, particularly worried. And so we do need to think about the intergenerational, the kind of future generations aspect of the issue as well. What we also know is that in order to reach our very low carbon future that we need to get to very quickly, we need to not only have the right technologies and products, but we also need to change our lifestyles very significantly. So this figure here comes from a very recent report from the UK Committee on Climate Change, their 6th carbon budget report, where they calculated the contribution that can come from different sorts of measures to reach net zero emissions, so zero emissions. And you can see that while about 40% is technological change on its own, the rest of the changes required are at least to some extent behavioural and social change. So they require us to do different things in our day-to-day lives. What specifically are we talking about? Well, the sorts of behaviours that we need to change include changing our diets. So we need to eat more plant-based foods. We need to eat specifically less red meat and dairy. That has the highest carbon impact. We also need to waste less food. So we know that emissions from food waste are amongst the most powerful greenhouse gases. So cutting our food waste by planning meals and using leftovers, for example, is another good thing we can do. Mobility, so transport, particularly car travel and flying, is a very significant part of our carbon footprint. So the more we can walk and cycle, use public transport, the lower our carbon footprint will tend to be. And we can also replace journeys in some cases by doing things virtually like this. So we haven't had to emit any carbon to travel across Europe to be together. Other things that we can do include reducing the amount of new things that we buy, our material consumption. And so we can share things, we can reuse things, buy secondhand things, and so on, recycle as well, as we just heard. And we can use less energy in the home to heat and cool our buildings. So there's lots of things that we can do. These percentages, by the way, are roughly the amount that these different activities contribute to our carbon footprint. So you can see food and mobility alone makes up about half of our carbon footprint. But another argument for why we should change our behaviour is not only that by changing these things that I've just mentioned, we can cut our carbon footprint and help tackle climate change, but also because actually it can make us happier. So we know, for example, that while it is important to have a certain level of income to meet our basic needs. We need enough money to have a house and enough food, etc., and enough money to clothe ourselves. Actually, once you get to a certain level of income, people's happiness tends to kind of level off. So it's not the case that very rich people are much happier than people with moderate levels of income. And so that's what this figure basically shows, is that with different ways of measuring, well, happiness and well-being, so in terms of stress or how you evaluate your life or how happy you are, actually at a certain level of income that tends to kind of level off and you don't get any further benefit. And that's because material consumption, so buying lots of stuff and having a big house and traveling around the world, etc., doesn't really satisfy our psychological needs, our basic human needs, which are for being competent, so being good at something, feeling like you've achieved something, autonomy, so having some sense of kind of freedom and ability to make decisions for yourself, and relatedness. So in other words, having a kind of social support network, having friends and family that you can rely on and being part of a community. Those things are better satisfied in general by lower carbon activities. So think about creative hobbies, and spending time with family and friends, gardening, being in green spaces. Those are things which generally have lower carbon footprints than consumption, shopping, and they make us much happier. But in other ways, actually, the sorts of changes that I've mentioned will also improve our lives. So I've mentioned eating more fruit and veg, eating less red meat, walking and cycling more. Those are things which will significantly improve our health, as well as cutting our carbon footprint significantly. And other things we can do, like saving energy in the home, that can often reduce our energy bills. So there will be a financial benefit. And more generally, as we think about recovering from COVID, the economic recovery that we need to make as a society, if we can invest in industries like insulation in homes or green technologies, the more we can create those sort of green jobs as we rebuild our economy, the more we can tackle climate change as well as have those economic benefits. The good news in terms of thinking about how to make this change is that actually there's a lot of public support for tackling climate change. So actually we found in our surveys, not just in the UK but elsewhere, that concern for climate change has been rising over the last few years, and actually has continued to rise a little bit even in 2020, when of course we were very worried also about COVID. So our concern has not been dented over the last year by the pandemic. And actually we see most people are also supportive of a green recovery from COVID. So they want to address climate change at the same time as addressing the need for economic recovery. But of course, those positive attitudes and that support amongst most members of the public for tackling climate change needs to be translated into action. And the good news is that COVID has in some ways provided an opportunity to actually change people's habits, because a lot of the things that we've been doing in the last few months in lockdown, involving traveling much less, saving water and energy at home in some cases, cutting food waste, we've seen a lot of people doing that, buying less, spending more time in the garden, reading, etc. Those sorts of things tend to have much lower carbon footprint than the things we were doing before the pandemic. And actually many people have said there are things about those changes that they've enjoyed and they want to maintain. But the key issue is how we actually retain those behaviour changes in the longer term. When restrictions are lifted from COVID, will we continue to do some of these things? And that completely depends on having the right infrastructure in place in cities and towns, and more widely, having the right technologies to support these changes, having the right social and economic policies in place. Because we know, and this figure comes from the United Nations Environment Programme Emissions Gap report that recently came out, we know that changing lifestyles requires not only awareness amongst the public, so we do need to give people information, but that alone is not enough. We also need structural change, so we need the economic policies, the infrastructure, etc. We need the social change, so we need public participation in activities, and we need to change norms and the sort of media context as well. And my final point is that the timing is also really important. So we have an opportunity as we transition out of lockdown and out of the COVID restrictions back into some level of normality. In order to retain the sort of low carbon habits that we've got, we need to really this is a golden opportunity, because habits tend to be a barrier to behavior change. But where there is this disruption to habits that the pandemic has caused, this is actually a good opportunity to get people to do things in new ways, because we know from previous studies like this one, where they gave people some information about the bus service in their area and a free ticket to try the bus. That was only effective for people who had recently moved house, and it increased bus use amongst that group very significantly, whereas it didn't have any effect on people that hadn't recently moved house. So actually, periods of disruption provide really good opportunities to get people to do things in new ways. So just to finish, climate change is an urgent issue, but it's in order to address it, we need to change our lifestyles, but doing that will actually improve our lives in general. In order to change our lifestyles, we need to engage with people to understand what's important to them. We need to design interventions with wider benefits in mind, so well-being benefits, health benefits, etc., equity. We need to implement multiple interventions, so social norm changes, pricing policies, redesigning cities, and we need to get the timing right. So we really need to use this opportunity as we come out of the pandemic to implement these changes, to lock in the emerging low carbon habits that we've seen people adopting.